make sure we have enough time to get all of Dan's presentation in. I wanted to thank everyone for coming. I'm so excited to see all of the familiar faces and a couple of new ones as well, and be able to meet all of you tonight. So just as a quick intro, my name is Hannah Osborn, and this is the meetup group for Self-Driving Cars 101, the Detroit University chapter. And if you haven't been to one of these events, it's just kind of casual, just for everyone to get together and talk about our love for autonomy and all of the technologies that go into making this happen. Today we're going to hear from Dan Bartz talking about the history of autonomy, and just to let you know, we are going to leave about 10 minutes at the end, so if you have any questions, you can save them for the end and we'll be sure to get to them then. And a couple of things I want to pass out before we start. First of all, Dan Bartz, thanks so much. I'm really excited to see this presentation. Thanks for bringing the food. Thanks to Dan Bartz and Volkswagen for that as well. Of course, Dataspeed for the beverages and for hosting us, and Tidy Bodell and Sanya Jordan for all of the work that you guys did to coordinate all of this. And absolutely Paul Flack, the owner and CEO of Dataspeed, for letting us into his beautiful office and sharing the space with us. On that note, I'm going to hand it to Paul, and you can take it away. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Can you hear me okay? Great. I hope everybody's enjoying the pizza. Thanks again, Dan.
Sure thing.
Cottage pizza. I know every Friday here we have on that same bench we always have pizza. That's part of our tradition here at Dataspeed. So a little bit about Dataspeed. I'll keep it real short, but we're an engineering services company specializing in autonomous vehicles. So I won't go too much more into that. But if you'd like to know more, I'd reach out to one of the Dataspeed folks who's here, who I would like you to raise your hand right now if you're a Dataspeed person. So just kind of make a mental note of any of these people. Just go up and ask them if you're interested in knowing a little bit more about Dataspeed. With that, Dan Bartz, he is, I don't know, how many of you know Encyclopedia Brown, the story of Encyclopedia Brown? Encyclopedia Brown, just for the younger folks, was he'd always solve mysteries, and it's because he had so much information. So I called Dan, he's the Encyclopedia Brown of autonomy. Quickie little story. Gosh, this is going back 9 years in San Francisco for an autonomous vehicle event when AV was a lot smaller back then. But Dan and I had the pleasure of, we were walking around together, and Dan educated me on the history of denim and Levi's, where Levi's, they were developed or, came out of San Francisco. I was reminding Dan of that, and he reminded me of the blue jeans that he has on right now, which are a very special type of blue jean denim that is Levi's that came out of Japan.
Yep. Kaihara Mills, yeah.
Oh, very good. So Dan has been in the automotive vehicle space for 20 years. He's got a BS degree in mechanical and electrical engineering from Kettering, and an MS degree in robotics from Carnegie Mellon, and he was a very early adapter of AV technology when he participated in the 2005 and 2007 DARPA Challenge. So with that, Dan's going to talk about, I think it's the history of autonomy, and it should be a very interesting presentation.
Okay.
So with that, Dan, here you go.
Thank you. Microphone? No microphone? Okay, I'll do no microphone. So once again, I'm Dan Bartz, and an interesting fun fact with textiles and denim, some of the very first mechanical computers were the Jacquard looms, which came with the invention of the punch card, which became a staple of the early computing industry. In fact, a lot of the concepts that came out of textiles, we still talk about today. When we talk about multi-threading or in GPU warps, those are textile terms that have been adapted to computing because of kind of that legacy. So when Paul brings it up, there's always a story that kind of goes with it. So Paul mentioned the DARPA Grand Challenge, and I was unfortunately did not get to be involved in the 2004 challenge, which was the first one, but I was on the Carnegie Mellon team for the 2005 challenge. This is a picture from the starting line. I was on the red team, which had both of these red Humvees, and then Stanford was the Volkswagen, which I now work for Volkswagen, and once again they pay for our food. But this was a really cool event, and I was actually talking with Steve Wozniak while I was taking this picture. So kind of need to be in some of the what we think of now as the early days. But a lot of this talk I wanted to go back a lot further, because how I got interested in automated driving was about some of the work that had been done much earlier than this. And I think it's kind of important to know kind of where your roots are and where the history comes from to kind of figure out where you're going. So to paraphrase the Moody Blues song, Futures of History Past, a long road to automated driving. So that was a fun one. Okay, so going back before the early days of the automobile itself, in 1895, the Chicago Times-Herald held the first race in the U.S., first automobile race in the U.S. Of 100 cars that entered, only, I believe it was 6 were in race already driving condition by the time they got to the starting line. And of those 6 that started, only 2 finished. So this was a 54-mile race around the outskirts of Chicago. It took 10 hours. Now, it didn't take 10 hours to do 50 miles because the cars only went 5 miles an hour. It took 10 hours because they had to stop and fix the cars every few miles, because that was the level of reliability in 1895. And if you think about kind of the early days of autonomy and some of the reliability and the technical challenges, those were part of the automobile when the automobile was in its infancy. What was nice about having a race is it kind of forces you to deal with those problems. And by the way, of the 2 cars that finished, Duryea was the winner in electric, and then Benz was running on Duryea was gasoline, Benz was electric. A few years later, Henry Ford decides he wants to get into racing and builds a car called the Sweepstakes. Now, Ford's idea here was, let's build a car that kind of works and was reliable and that didn't really need to be fixed along the way. He still had his mechanic right along just in case, but came up with a lot of technical innovations, for example, like ceramic spark plugs and other things that he thought would improve the reliability. And he was going up for quite a bit of money against Winton, which you saw the quote from earlier about cars not having brains. Winton was a much more powerful car, much faster in pretty much any way you could think of in terms of driving faster, but it was typical of the reliability of the cars of the day. Ford was able to beat Winton because he didn't have to fix his car during the race. And the Winton Ford Sweepstakes race was what raised Ford the money to start the Ford Motor Car Company. And so we're starting to see here how reliability is already kind of shaping the industry. And also we're seeing how racing kind of shaped the industry. Everything from pneumatic tires to electric hybrids, which was 1902 Ferdinand Porsche, rearview mirrors, disc brakes, these were all racing developed technologies. Fast forward a few years to get to the Ford Model T. Ford decides we're going to build cars like appliances, strips out all of the extra frivolalities and gets a car down to its lowest point, $400 a copy. His competitors, namely the General Motors and the Chryslers of the day, realized that maybe customers want something a little bit more than the bare bones, and so they really focus on kind of building cars that focus on kind of fashion goods and this idea of the annual model change. And so this concept we now have in computing and in smartphones, wherever you get a new phone, because last year's one is outdated, not because it doesn't work, but because it's no longer the coolest one. This was a model that the auto industry innovated in order to sell more cars to people who already had cars. Because if you owned a Ford Model T, there's no reason to buy a new one because they didn't change for 20 years. But with cars bringing concepts like color, bringing new body lines every year, bringing new technologies every year, more efficiency, more performance, they built a reason to buy a new car even if you already had a perfectly good one. Also with this came new concepts in financing. The ideas of being able to trade in your old car for a new one at the dealership. The idea of taking whatever you owed on the new car and amortizing in monthly payments are concepts we now take for granted in the smartphone industry, but they're really pioneered in the automobile. And kind of how the automobile pioneered this model we now think about for modern electronics, the whole fashion aspect of modern electronics, just a few decades earlier. Now we're starting to see in aviation more automation tools to help make airplanes more efficient, flight more efficient, and also safer. The autopilot, autopilot was developed in 1930. In the same time period, we're seeing the very first automatic landing systems, instrumented landing systems being developed, where airplanes could follow a radio beacon in bad weather to know where the runway was, even though they couldn't see it. And so some of these concepts of intelligent machines, even if it was done through vacuum tubes and valves and relays, we're starting to see. But the ideas are starting to form.
When the car leaves the factory, only one thing is needed for safety, and that's a careful driver. If the manufacturer could equip every car with an automatic driving mechanism, the car would always do just what it should do when it got out on the road.
And so this video actually would go on to explain all of the things that an automatic car would do for you in terms of staying in the lanes and stopping at stop signs and following the speed limits. And this video was one of a series of videos that Jam Handy put together for General Motors that would show in front of movies, because the car was new technology. People tend to be afraid of what they don't understand, and so using these movie trailer-like film clippets to explain how technology worked was something that was done to make the public more accepting of automotive technology. You would also see a lot of these road shows and pamphlets. GM's Motorama exhibit was a traveling show. Chrysler published a series of comic books on automotive technology that explained this stuff to people who were used to pre-electric, pre-phone kind of rural living, and now we're getting these very advanced technologies coming at people really, really quickly. Things like how engines worked, they didn't grow up with these things, and they're kind of important things to know if you're going to own an automobile. It also helps make the technology less scary if you could understand the basics of what makes an engine work. And so this was a booklet called Power Primer that was basically Engines 101 for the layperson. So with all of this new technology coming really quickly, there was always a thirst for what's the next thing that's going to come out here. And so this is an actual poster that Hughes, as Howard Hughes, put together for the World's Fair. It's not a Rocketeer poster. This is what the vision was from Howard Hughes for the 1939 World's Fair, is that someday we'll have jetpacks. Someday we still will have jetpacks. General Motors decided, well, with all this annual model change and all these new technologies, we got to show what 20 years from now is going to look like if we really want to get people excited about the future of the automobile, the future of the highway system, which didn't exist at this point.
To the 1960s express motorway.
I apologize for the low resolution, because it's fine here, but...
Traffic moves at unreduced rates of speed. Safe distance between cars is maintained by automatic radio control. Curved sides assist the driver in keeping his car within the proper lane under all circumstances. The keynote of this
Notice they had divided highway lanes
safety.
with cement barriers.
Safety with increased speed.
His concept for cities was that the cars and the pedestrians weren't even on the same level. That the sidewalk would be above the cars, because how are you going to get to a city where you don't have to slow down? Like, one of his design philosophies when designing his concept of a highway system was you should be able to get from New York to San Francisco in 24 hours, which meant you had to maintain an average of 100 miles an hour across the country. And so all of these concepts he came up with for this highway system, he put this huge diorama that after the World's Fair, it actually wound up at Disney. In fact, there's some of the very first Disney rides were some of the stuff that GM had kind of reused from their Futurama exhibit. And I've actually got a technical paper that explains how these things were put together and how they all worked. But this was kind of a view of the riders. Would be up in these little pods. There would be speakers kind of telling them the narration. and then these little animatronic cars would glide on this roadway. And this was designed so that the cars never had to slow down, for signalized intersections. Also, if you wanted to get across the country in 24 hours, you had to design highway interchanges that allowed you to maintain that 100 miles an hour through the interchanges. So the concept that we now think of kind of cloverleaf highways was really started with some of the work that Bel Geddes was doing as kind of an industrial designer, industrial engineer. And taking the concept from the airplane instrument landing system, eventually evolved from the side curved walls to electrical wire underneath the roads that would broadcast a radio wave that the cars would use to localize it on the center of the road. And in 1940, he wrote a book about all this work he had done called Magic Motorways, which is so old now it's public domain. But he envisioned that by the 1960s, we would have what we think of now as ADAS functionalities. And car-to-car communication. Imagine if your car could talk to the other car when you're approaching a traffic intersection and they could coordinate so they wouldn't have to slow down, right? We've seen videos like this, some of these concepts of the future. But he was working on this in 1940, figuring out what the timing would need to be and how the cars would send messages to each other to be able to accomplish this. A little ahead of his time, but some really interesting concepts that we now kind of take for granted. And in fact, Norman Bel Geddes' work was so far ahead of its time that he got invited by Franklin Roosevelt up to the White House in 1941 to conduct a workshop on automated highway systems. And he had designed his entire layout for what the U.S. interstate would look like. Now, the precursor to what went up from NHTSA had their own design, and he convinced the administration of the superior of his design, and ultimately what we built is much closer to what Bel Geddes had come up with than what the precursor to NHTSA had come up with. And so a lot of the things we think about today with our highway system, we had already been thinking about how to automate it when we were first building it. Now, unfortunately, something called World War II happens, and it's really devastating. But out of it, a lot of really amazing new technologies are created, including jet engines and new forms of guided systems. And this car, the Firebird Bird, I keep on fixing that, and I forgot to fix it in this copy. The guy in the driver's seat is Bill Spreitzer. Do you know Bill Spreitzer, Jim?
No, I'm not that old.
Well, Bill was still hanging around the research labs when I started as a co-op student in 2000, and he was telling me about all the days when they were working on self-driving cars, and it's like, kids today don't have enough ambition. Back in my day, we were working on cars that drove themselves, and what are you going to do with your life? And so it was kind of Bill's kind of nodding that got me to think about automated driving, and when the DARPA Grand Challenge came around, that sounded like a lot of fun. Unfortunately, Bill passed away about a year and a half ago, I think. But this is what he looked like in 1956, where he was an engineer working on turbine engines, the jet engines that powered some of these concept cars. He would later, in his later years, become a big proponent of the automated highway system in its various incarnations throughout the decades. Now, this car is also interesting. All titanium body car, a decade before the SF71. First car with disc brakes, first car with independent suspension. I'll show you a video of what they thought about a guidance system, a preliminary form of what we might think of as a FaceTime in a 1950s car, two-way video conferencing in your car.
Move to electronic control strip in center lane.
Now, this was a snippet I kind of cut together very shortly because it was really long, but of the vision of autopilot, because the technology didn't quite exist in 56, but the idea did.
You're now under automatic control. Hands off steering.
So the idea was we would have these automated highways that were specific for automated vehicles, that regular vehicles that are human-driven couldn't drive on, because all of the intelligence was going to be controlled by centralized computers, kind of like what's called the Sage missile system, which is how we would track Russian missiles coming in and fire our missiles back. This idea of centralizing one giant computer brain to control all the cars, that was the concept. And so that one giant computer brain would have to figure out how to route other cars. And so the different state highway organizations, as part of the precursor to AASHTO, started working on routing algorithms. And, in fact, they settled on Dijkstra's algorithm, which was one of the first search algorithms ever invented. And it's basically the precursor to the algorithm we use today in algorithmic search. You know, your nav system will use some variation of that Dijkstra's algorithm developed in the late 1950s. But the idea was that algorithm could help all these automated cars figure out how to get from where they were starting to where they were going, because this giant computer brain would have to figure all that out. And so the idea then was that the road would have to be so smart because you couldn't possibly fit all of that computing power into a car. You know, that we just didn't have the technology. But even then, we'd have to figure out how to make the drive-by-wire work. And so, keep in mind, fly-by-wire didn't exist yet. Fly-by-wire was another decade away. But you already have work being done on drive-by-wire. In fact, some of the first transistors used in research were used in these control systems because vacuum tubes were too big. And so the idea was, if you could make everything controllable by a joystick, you could also make it controllable by a computer. And so unit control was one of the first features that were designed to help enable this technology. Firebird 3, which would be the follow-up concept car to the Firebird 2, would not have a joystick instead of a steering wheel. And to augment all of the transistors in the joystick itself, we had an entire bank of vacuum tubes to help with the analog brains to figure out how the car should apply the gas and the brakes based on the signals that the highway was telling it. And so a big chunk of the car was dedicated to all these little vacuum tubes here in order to control the car. Here were the radio antennas that would pick up the signal from the road, and it was designed so that if either one of these failed, it could still operate. So they had redundancy. In fact, the entire system was designed so that all of the components that could fail, which all the components, the goal was to have them fail less often than humans have fatalities. And they worked through all of the reliability equations at a point where we didn't even have failure modes effects analysis. At this point, we didn't have fault trees. These tools, engineering tools, didn't exist when this was being done. So these guys were inventing these methodologies kind of by the seat of their pants to be able to show, you know, if we can't get there by making one component reliable, how do we make a backup that can improve the overall reliability?
Unit control is a new concept in steering, designed to simplify your driving task. This system uses specially developed electronic computers to control hydraulic power servos, which actuate...
This guy's an engineer, by the way. Did you guess it?
Can you show?
Joe Bidwell.
So accelerate, steer left or right, pull back for braking. Rotation of the control knob selects forward, reverse, or park. There is no mechanical connection between the control knob and the front wheels, but car motion feedback is supplied to the driver by the mass of the knob.
An early form of stability control
Yes,
using
we have also
knobs and
added
a pendulum.
an automatic guidance system and cruise control. 2 pickup coils mounted under the front of the car straddle a current carrying wire embedded in the highway.
And so another thing this car had, it had a second engine to power all of the hydraulics and to power all of the electrical systems, because the turbine engine was geared at such a high RPM that it wasn't really practical for running all that. Plus, you didn't want the turbine engine running all the time. So it had an APU before APUs were really considered to be a thing.
Want to sit back and relax? Well then, set in the speed you want to drive and switch over to automatic guidance.
So this is actually a functioning system now. Firebird 2 was make-believe. But within a few years, you're going to get a prototype. That accomplished a very simple guided system. The year after that, GM brought up the Cadillac Cyclone concept car, which the interesting feature in the front is 2 radomes. It had the one of the first collision warning systems, similar to very old alarm clocks, where there was one needle that told you based on your current speed how long it was going to take to stop, and another needle that told you the distance to the car in front of you, and when the 2 needles touched, the buzzer went off and said you're too close to the car in front of you. You know, there was a lot of talk about these concepts, but the technology at the time was limited in terms of being too annoying and just not practical. Over a few cities over, actually back then it would have been not that far, Highland Park, Chrysler was working on the first adaptive cruise control system, which they would call Autopilot. Now, when Autopilot got brought into production, they dropped the adaptive part and just made the world's first cruise control, because cruise control hadn't been invented yet. They had told the press all about all the progress with using radars to control car brake and throttle, only to realize that they don't know that they're looking at the car in front of them and the car in the lane over. They don't, you know, when the car's going up or down a hill, they can't track the car on the other side of the hill. There was all these technical reasons why it was really a bad idea with 1950s radars to control 1950s brakes automatically. And so when they brought out Autopilot, it was just a regular cruise control. You set the speed you want to go, and the car would follow that. After 1 year, they realized Autopilot is a horrible name for a cruise control because people thought it did more than it actually does. And so some of these problems we see kind of repeating themselves. But the press loved this stuff. And so there was all these articles. This is Popular Science. And this was that chart that explained how the redundancy worked. And you know, they're trying to convince the public that we've done all our engineering homework and we know how to make this thing really reliable. And over the course of 10 years, this is just the New York Times, over 10 years, 60 articles about automated driving in the New York Times. You know, the press was just really fascinated about this. And there was discussion about whether we're going to do driver assistance before we do fully driving, or should humans be banned? When are robotic chauffeurs going to come? And we have different states bidding to build the first automated highways. Ohio, Michigan, and Maine each were promised to build 100 miles of automated test highway. And they put together, I think it was like $30 million each to be able to do this. Well, what are the kids up to at this point in time? Well, this is about the era of the hot rod. And what's on the radio? So, with all this talk about this really cool technology, you have a car culture that is really starting to blossom. And people like thinking about cars and sleeping about, you know, dreaming about cars. And now you have this automated highway concept where there is no opportunity to drive yourself. It has to be automatic, because that was what the technology of the 1950s allowed for, was that everything had to be automatic or nothing could be automatic. And the auto execs started to realize, if I put more horsepower in a car, I can sell it for more money. But I'm having a hard time selling automatic headlamps. I'm having a hard time selling power windows. I'm having a hard time selling fuel injection. I'm having a hard time. These are all things that existed in the 50s that didn't exist in the 60s. We had fuel injection in the 50s, and in the 60s it was removed. We had automatic dimming high beams. It's because what really sold cars in the 60s was power. So this hot rod culture that kind of found its way out in Southern California kind of became one of the driving aspects for production cars in the 1960s. You also had this concept called automation anxiety, which is something you're starting to hear now. All the robots are going to replace everybody. Everyone's going to have their jobs replaced by robots. In fact, it got to be such a big problem that President Johnson put together a Blue Ribbon Commission to study whether the U.S. economy would be destroyed by automation. And over the next 10 years, all the cool automated highway articles were being replaced by automation is going to destroy everything articles. And so these car companies that spent all this money working on automation said, well, this isn't probably the best way to get a return on our investment. What else could we have all these engineers do? So they put them on the space program. So Chrysler had been the prime contractor on all of the space rockets up through the Saturn IIB. General Motors would be the prime contractor for the guidance system of Apollo 11, the lunar rover, the fly-by-wire, which this is the first fly-by-wire based on drive-by-wire from a decade earlier. And having their engineers work on this was much better PR for them than having them work on technology that they thought their customers were scared of. What you find out, so this is the lunar rover. Notice anything about the control stick?
Oh, yeah.
Same system, it's Unicontrol. The engineers from the GM Research Labs in Warren were sent out to the Pacifica Research Labs, which is where GM had their, a lot of the defense work, and they brought with them the Unicontrol technology for the lunar rover. In fact, even the instrument cluster has a vague resemblance to the concept. And so this early attempt at automation kind of faded away with the lack of customer interest at the time. This was also a time period where safety is becoming both a necessity and a hard sell. Ford brings out the first seat belts in 1957, and their sales plummet. The contemporary thinking was that if a car has to have seat belts, then it's probably not a safe car. Motor Trend did a survey in 1958, and they found out that over 90% of Americans think that they're fantastic drivers, and that the people who need safety technology are the remaining, 10%. It was really hard to sell safety in the very early days of the automobile because it implied that there was something wrong with the driver. Either something wrong with the product or something wrong with the driver. So thus kind of began the multi-decade push back and forth between the automakers developing new safety technologies and regulators regulating it, and the customers kind of not picking and choosing the things that they would or wouldn't take. If anyone remembers the automatic seat belts, you could have automatic seat belts or an airbag, and it turns out people got really frustrated with those automatic seat belts. But Hollywood decides, well, some of these automated vehicle concepts are kind of cool, so maybe we could, make some money off of them if we give them a little personality, spiff them up, get racing involved, because racing always makes things better. So we've got Herbie in the 60s. And so for some younger folks may not remember this, but in the 80s there was this really cool car that was sometimes driven and sometimes not driven by David Hasselhoff. So the idea we have with concepts like KIT, which one of our vice presidents at Chrysler really loved the idea of autonomy being KIT and not being HAL, was putting the sensing in the car, putting the intelligence in the car. Don't put it in the highways, put it in the vehicle, but do so in a way that gives you more freedom to drive when you want to and to automate when you don't want to drive.
Operating the system is just like
and so this is one of the first adaptive cruise control systems that actually went into production. This was GM and Hughes Research. Remember Hughes from earlier, the Rocketeer people? In fact, I worked with some of these very early Gen 1 radars. Remember you used some of the ACC ones, right?
1999.
Lane lock?
The vehicle in the center of the lane. The vehicle senses where it is and locks into the lane.
You missed one.
I know I missed a bunch. There was Ernst Dickman's, I couldn't find a good video of his, but
Harvey Earl's first lane following car was an analog camera, and he did the first collision mitigation braking demo to reporters.
Who is this?
Harvey Earl, the designer at GM.
Oh, Harley?
Harley Earl, yeah.
So Harley Earl also, I knew his grandson, Harley Earl also tried to justify those enormous tail fins that they improved vehicle stability. So he paid Stanford University to do a research study to prove that tail fins added to vehicle stability. So he was trying to, he was a engineering dropout that decided to invent styling for the auto industry. Made a lot more money doing that. There's some other things I kind of skipped over, but I kind of wanted to pick on some of the highlights and do a little Carnegie Mellon-centric overview, just because I have a little bit more familiarity. But by the time we get into the early 90s, we have a new reauthorization of the automated highway bill. Congress tells the auto manufacturers, prove what could be done with today's technology. You guys talked about this in the 50s. If you were to do it today, how would you do it? You know, you would do it obviously a lot differently. These are a series of vehicles that the first two are funded by the Department of Defense, hence the Humvees. These are the NAVLab vehicles. The last one was that, I think that's NAVLab 5. Ended up being the first car to do coast-to-coast automation 95% of the time hands-free. And so this was late 80s, early 90s. And some of the work that was done here, we still use the same lexicon and terminology that they were developing. In fact, even if you looked at the software stack, you would see some similarities of concepts that were being developed back then. And so now the idea is putting the intelligence in the vehicle and don't require smart, well, we were still kind of debating the infrastructure. Maybe we put a magnet in the road so the car could read the magnet, but the magnet's not smart. It just tells you where the lane marker is. But knowing the distance to the car in front of you, that would be the car. Maybe we could do that with cameras, the detecting of the lanes, which is what this project demonstrated. But we're now seeing a paradigm shift in how it works. The question is, have we had a paradigm shift in what the customer's asking for? So I threw some pictures in here from the DARPA challenge because people really love hearing about the DARPA challenge. And so this is the 2005 DARPA challenge, which was the off-road, second off-road one, and a little bit behind the scenes of the vehicle builds. This is the behind the scenes. This is the guys from PBS filming our robot, and I'm filming, taking pictures of them.
It's over at the NREC building.
What?
Is that it, the NREC building?
No, this is the Planetary Robotics building that got torn down to build the new Bill Gates building.
Okay.
So this building doesn't exist anymore. But,
It's at the Roundhouse, though.
what?
It's at the Roundhouse.
No. So you know where the Gates building is now, right?
Yeah.
There used to be an old
Okay.
warehouse-looking thing.
Mining research. It was Bureau of Mines.
Yep, Bureau of Mines.
There was
Yep.
a school there, yeah.
Yep. So that's where we did all
That's
of
where
the
they really
development.
have rocks. Right.
In fact, this is where some of the very first interplanetary robotics research was being done in this building. So we get to the competition, and we have to prove that our vehicles can get around the course and that they follow the stop button. And so this was the qualifiers. This vehicle had a little bit of a malfunction and basically took out a jersey barrier that this guy was standing behind, which one of my teammates, and he got kind of cut up from the fall. If you see the PBS documentary, it's a pretty spectacular crash. We had some sponsors with more money than maybe intellect, but we had, Red, by the way, was the name of our team and the name of the gentleman who led our team, Red Whitaker. And so one of our sponsors had Red flown in, wherever you call it, where they have the airplanes, write the letters. Chip Ganassi was one of our sponsors, which became very controversial because when we were at doing the qualifiers, the LA Speedway was officially a Pepsi venue, and Chip Ganassi was sponsored by Coke, and it's like, he wouldn't be seen drinking Pepsi, and they had a contract for Pepsi only, so we had to get like special dispensation to drink Coke in his tent, so. This is Hugh Cato, one of our colleagues, decided to photobomb my shot. Here's one of our, I think one of our two teams. So we broke our team in half. One went with one robot, one with the other. But for the photos, this is the photo. I'm here somewhere, I think. Oh, that's me. We get to the race. This is the morning of. Let's see. This is my favorite shot. I love this shot. So this is where I'm talking with the Woz, Steve Wozniak. Steve Wozniak came to our tent and wanted to take pictures with us and have us sign his stuff. And it's like, how cool is that? And then we borrowed his air card so that we could like use the internet at the hotel we were at. Didn't have internet. So this is the morning of the race. Really beautiful shot. We had two robots. One we said go fast, one we said go slow, and our slow robot beat our fast robot because our fast robot had some engine problems because we flipped it over on its roof a week earlier. I've heard different stories as to what exactly happened, but if our fast robot went fast or our slow robot went a little bit faster, we would have come in first, but we came in second and third. And I think the times, now you may know the numbers better than I do. What was it? It was like 7 hours and like 4 or 5 minutes for Stanford, and we were like 6 minutes after that. So over 7 hours, we came in second by 6 minutes.
And it turned out to be a connector problem.
Yeah.
In the engine control unit. So just one pin just wasn't
Seated.
right. You can actually press it and get the full throttle out of it.
And this is our slow robot coming in at the finish line. Okay, so we have the DARPA challenge, and it shows off-road autonomy. The idea from going like Baghdad, Kuwait to Baghdad, fully autonomous. Well, there's a whole lot of other things you're going to have to figure out if you're going to do autonomy kind of in the real world. And so, Jim, were you on that letter we wrote? I know Jeremy, myself, Varsha, were you on the letter we wrote to DARPA? This is, you've got to do this again, but in urban. And so DARPA decided to do urban. And this is a Terramax.
Dan's team, for the record. I was on the winning team on this one.
Yeah, but I was on the heavy monster truck team that's really scary. And I did the steering control, so if you notice it went around that corner kind of hot. I'll show it again because I'm kind of proud of it, because I don't do a lot of coding, and this I did have a lot of fun with, is figuring out how fast I should go around the corner. Fast enough, not fast enough to roll over, but as fast as I could go beyond under that, and then try to take the corners as crisply as possible, given that...
You want to get rear ended there?
What?
He stopped right after him. It looked like the car behind him didn't expect it to stop.
Now, one of our secret sauces, we did have four-wheel steering, so we actually had the best turning radius of any vehicle in the competition. But it was either that or have the worst turning radius. And then we had
It was a
this
blue truck, that's for sure.
16 tons.
This is that left turn at the time some people.
Yeah.
It's a pretty tough turn with all the cars in here.
But it's pretty crisp for our this is what I call qualified pursuit, was our steering algorithm. So I was a little proud of that. So just kind of fast forward to kind of more modern times. We had that was 2007 was the DARPA Urban Challenge. 2008, Rick Wagner, CEO of short-time CEO, or soon-to-be short-time CEO of GM, announces fully self-driving cars by 2015 at the CES in 2008. So this is he was the first of the automakers to announce that. Then he kind of got pulled out of the company when they went bankrupt. A lot of the guys that had been on the team, the GM was starting up to do autonomy, got hired by this little startup called Google. And 18 months after the GM announcement, we find out that Google has a self-driving car program, kind of built with a lot of the same engineers. And Jim, do you want to say anything about some of this? You saw a different perspective of this. I was the military side at that point.
So what ended up happening is I think there was a little bit of an economic disagreement between Carnegie Mellon and General Motors. And in that, some of the folks didn't want to come to GM even though we were offering them, pretty good salaries to come over, and they decided Google was the way to go. And so they basically abandoned the mothership and went down the Google path. So it's kind of an interesting digression there in history. Had they come to GM, I think we would have actually held the 2015 timeline, but there was something else behind the scenes. I don't remember exactly.
Oh,
what
maybe it was bankruptcy?
No, actually, believe it or not, we were funded 100% all the time, sometimes up to 150% when we ran out of money in the 100. So it wasn't money, it wasn't the visionaries at GM that were not seeing this. So the other parts of GM were seeing pain and suffering. But for us, if we needed it, we got it. And basically, I was doing the perception system at General Motors for most of this time period. So I was doing all the radars, the cameras, and the sensor fusion, writing a fusion tracker software that we had in there. And I've told a few people here that that tracker software is what I put into the F-15 fighter jet in 1998. And then when I came over to GM, that's when I put basically, I remember what I did, and I just basically put it in that one too. So, yeah, brings back memories.
So just a little plugging for my current company. This was Jr., which I think that came in second in the Urban Challenge after Carnegie. And then, Audi has kind of had lots of visions of what autonomy is going to look like. They, in the spirit of racing, decided to do Pikes Peak in 2010. Now, arguably, if you actually understood, like, they claimed they did it in 30 minutes. A Model T did it in 1928 in 20 minutes. So 30 minutes wasn't a blazingly fast speed, but if you've ever seen Pikes Peak, going too fast is deadly, And so I put some little clips in here from Fine Dance, what a really high performance run would look like. But this was really starting to say, what can we really do with this technology as we understand more about the dynamics, and the car starts to really get into the physics. And the guys at Stanford who got into this, I know, are really interested in what physics could be done. This is one of our vehicles, Jack. Let's see, we're at the time, 47 minutes. What do we have for time? Okay. So the rest of this, I just threw some slides together kind of on my thoughts on like car culture and what we can learn from history in terms of like understanding the consumer. For a while, we thought that young people didn't like cars. It may have been the recession of 2008 when nobody had any money, so nobody was buying new cars. It's typically automakers track new car sales, not used car sales. If you were tracking used car sales, you would realize young people were buying interesting cars, just not new ones. And we see over the course of 3 years going from millennials aren't going to buy cars in the end of the auto industry to maybe millennials do like cars. Let's go over this. I have a whole bunch of data on millennials would rather give up their smartphone than give up their car, but that never gets reported because it's not as provocative as some of the smaller research studies that say the opposite. I know this is an older song, but it's the only song I have time that talks about adaptive cruise control. And so, a lot of talk has been given to the fact that young people aren't buying Beach Boys albums anymore, and maybe car culture is dying. Well, no, it's shifting, and you have rappers singing about the exact same things that the surf rock folks were singing about decades earlier. It just, those things tend not to be tracked by the people who do like automotive planning. I put this chart I found this chart, and I got a lot of laughs when I showed it at Chrysler. This is car brand references in rap songs by year. And we do see that during the recession that we do have a recession in car references, but after the recession it more than recovered. So there are ways to look at kind of car culture besides just some of the things we think about. And there's also
so what's the most referenced car?
that was easy. 1964 Impala, if you want a particular model. So 1964 Impala is the most singular reference car. Okay, fewer 16-year-olds have driver's licenses. Some people say that's because young people don't like cars as much. It also might be because you can't get a driver's license in many states at 16 because of the graduated driver's license that has been rolled out. And so when you look at the time frames of comparing 16-year-olds in the 1980s with 16-year-olds in the 2010s, you've also got to consider that the requirements to get a driver's license are different. And so, I'm not saying that everybody wants to get a car, but we've got to be a little careful with some of these numbers that get thrown around because they're not necessarily apples and orangutans. AAA did just last week that talked about that there still isn't a lot of interest in these fully automated cars because there's a perception that you give up the ability to drive. And working for a car company that builds a lot of cars that are fun to drive, I think we are, as a company, fans of choosing when, the freedom to choose when to drive. Because I don't know anyone who likes driving in like horrible congestion. Driving in snowstorms is sometimes fun, but not always fun. And it's what we hear from the customers. If you really listen to their voice, is help me out of the parts of driving I don't like, and let me have the parts of driving I do like. And so I think as we think about some of the future of the technology, because we have this intelligence now in a way we didn't have with the smart highways in the 1950s, can we start to build some more refined experiences kind of based on what customers are willing to pay for? Because at the end of the day, you've got to sell it to the customer. Go through my versions of the levels of automation. So there's SE levels of automation. Oh, 2 minutes? I'll skip this. This is super simple version.
No one cares about
No, do that one, that's good.
Okay, so my version of the levels of automation, I work on the committee. Level 1 is feed off. Most typical at level 1, so level 0 is dumb car that you have to drive yourself. Level 1 is the first kind of step in automation, and it's either the car does the gas and the brake or the car does the steering. And so the most common level 1 feature that most people probably have familiarity with is adaptive cruise control. And with adaptive cruise control, for a large part of the drive, you can take your feet off the pedals. And so that's kind of the level 1. So level 2 is when you combine the gas and the brake with the steering into one feature. Your car may have a steering feature and a gas brake feature, but when you put them together like Tesla Autopilot, you're at level 2. The human is still responsible for all the traffic laws. He's still responsible for any time the system gets in over its head or doesn't see that pothole. With some of the more sophisticated level 2 systems, not all of them, like Super Cruise, the goal is to be able to take your hands off the wheel, but not necessarily your eyes off the road. And so the systems like Super Cruise or
that was done for safety reasons. After studying the human.
yes, humans will take their eyes off the road if you like them. Now when you get to level 3, you start to get to a point where you can start to take your eyes off the road, but you can't necessarily get to sleep. So the car is going to know how to find that pothole, it's going to know the traffic laws. It's generally responsible for driving, except when it gets in over its head and it needs help. Now there's a lot of controversy with level 3. Right now in the US, Mercedes is the only one that has it, and their feature only works in one state, because if they worked in more than one state, they'd have to implement all the traffic laws in each of those new states. In fact, Audi, which had a level 3 feature in Germany, tried to bring it to the US and found out we have to write the software differently for each state to deal with the variation in traffic law.
I heard it was also under a certain speed Mercedes would be level 3.
Well, it is. Both systems, the Audi and the Mercedes, have a top speed of 40 miles an hour, and only when you're in traffic. And there's all of these caveats with the assumption that people around
level
are
3.
what?
It's not a full level 3 that covers it.
It's something the marketing is going to call level 3, and I'm not going to go further than that because level 4, now you can start to take a nap. You can, kind of not have to worry about it. If it gets in trouble, it will, put itself in a safe stop, pull to the side of the road. The idea with level 4 is level 4 vehicles can't necessarily go everywhere and do everything, but they know what they can do, and they can do it safely, or they will put themselves in a safe state if they can't take the task. And then level 5, which I have kind of the guy off the vehicle, is you can do everything a level 4 can do, and you can do it everywhere a good human could do it. And so I like to think of the postman as a good example of the level 5. If you think about the saying, there was neither the rain nor sleet nor dark of night will keep us from our whatever's happening. The idea that an automated vehicle can go everywhere the postman is expected to deliver mail, including dirt trails up in the mountains where there are to deliver under all the conditions that a postman is expected to deliver. And that includes fairly heavy snowstorms. There are times when the snow gets heavy enough that they will cancel mail, but it's pretty rare. And so in my mind, if it's got an address you can write a letter to, and the postman's going to be delivering that day, that would be considered level 5. And so it's a technical challenge in terms of making the system robust under all different types of conditions. And so today where we're at is a lot of companies have some form of level 2. Companies are dabbling in the level 3. You've got the robo-taxis are level 4, but they're only level 4 in the very constrained environments that they've deployed them in. So you see a lot of companies deploying in like Phoenix, Arizona, where it almost never rains, it never snows, and they've got well-known routes. Not to say that it's a different problem they're trying to solve. And so building systems that kind of meet the customer needs depends on the customer, because there are different customers and different customer needs. And also, what's not on the levels, which I think people tend to underestimate, is what's called the operational design domain. When and where does this thing work? And so, some customers say, hey, can you give me a level 1 system that works in snowstorms? That's a really hard system to do. It's harder than a level 3 system that works on sunny days, but there's a customer demand for it. And so I think as we think about these levels, it's not just the level, like bigger levels are better, it's also designing systems that work reliably under the circumstances that customers kind of want to use them in. And so I think I'm out of the time, and so...
As you wish, Mr. Knight, but since you were still recovering from your ordeal and I detect we're in a slightly irritable mood caused by fatigue, may I suggest you put the car in auto cruise mode for safety's sake?
No, you may not. That's fine. Good night.
Good night.
See, this is what a good level 3 should be, is it should be understanding its customer, paying attention to his alertness level, and knowing when to shut up.
But it's not a level 3 because the driver is never expected to pick up where...
Understood. Kid is a level 5+++, but in terms of a dialogue where there's a relationship and the system
So we have a couple questions.
Sure.
Or if we need the mic, or if everyone can just speak loudly. Anyone have any questions?
I have a question. Were there, when you were talking about the automated roads, were any of those actually ever built?
So, I know that the Arizona Proving Grounds Gym had a lot of this automation, and I think that...
It did San Diego to Orange County, California with magnets in the road for years.
I-15, the commuter lane, had the magnets. There were some automated roads in Minnesota that were automated specifically for the snowplows.
Oh,
So they weren't automated for the daily drivers, but a lot of the snowplows to drive when there were heavy snowstorms. So some of this technology has been deployed in limited applications. And I know that one of the places that was built to test these automated roads, if anyone knows what's that, Ohio State, what's their, TRC. This TRC track that NHTSA uses for a lot of their testing, that was built for automated vehicles. That was its original goal, and then they realized, oh, we need to have a test track for all sorts of other things for cars. I mean, the idea of having crash tests was a new idea.
So, is this, okay. How do you think about the systems engineering principle of, like, if you optimize the components, you'll probably ruin the system performance in AVs and autonomy?
So, I mean, I think that's generally tends to bear out. Robust systems, the whole idea in systems engineering of robust systems is the idea that if you take any of the noise factors and you tweak them, the system performance should have very minimal impact to any of the variances of any of the noise factors. And so having, let's say you had this super sensor that was really, really awesome, it did all the heavy lifting, and then it failed, your system performance would have a huge setback. Whereas if all of the sensors were relatively the same strength, the ability to build a more robust system, now it's not necessarily an optimal system, but a more robust system is typically easier when you've weighted your system so that it's not dependent on any one sensor modality. And what we see a lot, we see some of the things in some of the AI algorithms where they can get really good at certain tasks and then fail at much more general tasks, like AIs that can identify specific breeds of dogs, but then sometimes fail to tell if it's a cat or a dog. So compared to a human, the AI will be able to tell you the breed much more often, but it misses sometimes the obvious fact that it's just a dog, or simple things like AIs have a hard time telling between donuts and bagels. And so over-optimizing, and we're seeing a lot more of this in some of the AI space. You can get to a system that has great performance under ideal circumstances, but then it tends to fall off a cliff when you're in less ideal circumstances. At least that's my personal experience with that.
But don't you need to run up AI, of course, deterministic versus heuristic? Those of us in here who have spent all these years in automotive, even if it works, you need, as an OEM, to be able to validate that it works and understand why it works and why it might not work at a given time. The opacity of AI automatically puts up that barrier to say, well, yeah, we got it working, we don't know exactly why. Do you see any future transparency in AI, or is that just outside the bounds of definition?
There is research being done, and right now it's kind of DARPA level research, meaning that it's considered to be almost an impossible problem, explainable AI. So one of the things about systems engineering that is also really important is decomposability. Taking a big problem, making it into small problems, showing that you can solve that small problem over enough of its use case, and then be able to show when you put that small piece back into the bigger puzzle, it still fits. And some of the problems with the AI algorithms is the AI algorithm works one way when you're looking at it as a standalone piece, and then you put it in the bigger puzzle and it works differently. Now, it may work better, but if it works differently, then you can no longer use the assumptions you had when you tested it as a standalone part. And so there's a lot of concepts in system engineering about like decomposability and then composability, which is, can I take the pieces apart and then can I put them back together and they still work back together? And so that's another important aspect to it is the ability to be able to understand how it operates in its context. And like I said, explainable AI is part of it, but also making sure that we're still decomposing systems. Even if we could develop this magic end-to-end AI that does everything from the camera comes in and then the steering wheel angle goes out, I can only know that system is as good as I can test it. And I need to be able to trust it much further than I can test it. I need to be able to trust it billions of hours, and I'm not able to test it to thousands of hours.
Well, doesn't that argue then that what we're calling level 3 deployment is in very limited ODD, and it's not really depending on the driver, because it's basically saying, if I come across something I can't do, I'm stopping, I'm pulling off, or I'm just stopping. Because that's not the traditional SAE level 3 that we've been talked about. So isn't it really a level 4 under a very restricted ODD?
So there are flavors of that. Like you would have a system that if the driver is not paying attention to the road, it does an MRC. So MRC is a requirement for level 4, it's not a requirement for level 3, but it's one way to mitigate the driver's not ready to do the takeover is I pull to the side of the road. And so instead of waiting until you need the driver and he's not ready, the moment the driver's not ready, the vehicle doesn't wait until he gets into trouble. It just pulls to the side of the road early. So that's one approach.
That is a true problem.
We'll see how they work in production, but I know a few OEMs that are doing it that way. So it's not just one OEM, there's several OEMs that are taking that type of approach. It's an evolution of kind of this super cruise approach. If you stop paying attention on super cruise, well, think of what just pulls on the stop sign lane, right?
Stops it.
Yeah.
When you do it 3 times in a row where you're not paying attention, it shuts it off for the ignition cycle. So then you gotta wait till you power it down and power it back up before you can power it down. Punishes you as a driver.
We have time for maybe one.
Okay.
I just had a question like presently you're talking about level 3 and level 4, level 5. All of it is under the presumption that we're taking the car to a city. But instead, if we went the other way and built the city for the car, like let's say exclusively the city will take nothing but automated cars and it'll be all automated. With the present technology, would we be able to attain level 5 under such circumstances like you built
That's what the tunnels are for.
So that was what Bill Gates was designing in the 1930s. Was he said if we built the infrastructure smart enough, we could have these relatively dumb cars that we have the roads. And so we could have done that. We had the opportunity to do that when we were building the Eisenhower highway system. But because of humans and the nature of how they want to experience driving, that we kind of missed that opportunity, I think. And I think we still can build smart cities.
The Tesla's doing it with the tunnels.
Well, the tunnels. You have some countries that don't have a lot of infrastructure that are...
Driving is a very American thing.
Yeah. And maybe a little bit German, too. And so other cultures, it might not be the same problem as it is in the U.S. But in the U.S., I think we have that opportunity. And I think going forward, we're going to have to build cars that are I think we're going to want to build cars as companies that want to make money, that people are willing to pay like a lot of money for. We don't want monetization of the automobile because what fun is that? How do you make money on that? In fact, recently we had one of our partners, Argo AI, which is a company that's doing level 4 autonomy. Between Volkswagen and Ford, we decided that that business model really didn't pan out. Both companies have said, we're going to do level 4. We're going to do level 4s on cars that people buy. Because there's really, it's hard to justify that much development cost and then try the only really advantage of giving the customer over an Uber is that you can give them a cheaper ride. It's hard to justify that cost per vehicle, development cost and all that. And so what we see, we're kind of the prevailing model most companies are going after, at least on the automotive scene. Trucking is a whole different story. There's a lot of money to be made on trucking, but on the passenger car market, we're seeing more evolution towards kind of a customer ownership model primarily as where you see a lot of the automakers. On the trucking side, there's a whole different equation that we have there.
I'm sorry, we probably didn't get to as many questions as they had, but maybe if you have some contact information that you want to share, they can.
Yeah, I've got a slide second, but I got
via email.
some really great self-autonomous racing cars, but my end credits. If you remember our guys from earlier in This is GM. Yeah. And here's 1950s FaceTime. Their video conferencing on their in-car video screen.
Good evening, Martin Hatter. Won't you be our guest? We have pushed button, listen and fair and fast. It's automatically controlling everything, and every digestive food is cooked by infrared. Okay, we'll understand what you say. Mr. Towerman, take a step right.
Roger, Firebird, I'm waving to the right. Hands on steering, Firebird, good night.
Anyway, I always think that's fun, but this is from my previous company I worked at, and they had a little. Anyway, that's my first email. Also, if you add the period in the middle and .vw or vw.com is my work email. But if you email me here, I can you can get a hold of me. So.
Great, thanks so much.